Okay, so the paper I'm going to give today is on Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri, who are a part of the autonomous Marxist movement. I just want to make clear beforehand, this paper is a critique of their philosophy from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, so that's the sort of bias you're going to get. However, first, I'm actually reading off the paper. I actually try to outline what I think is their main arguments for what they believe. After that, I'll give the critique. So I'm just going to read straight from the paper, and we'll discuss afterwards. So it is unquestionable that capitalism has changed from the time that Karl Marx first analyzed it with Das Kapital in 1867. Many Marxist thinkers in the 21st century have sought to update this analysis because of their view that capitalism has radically changed. Antonio Negri and Michael Hardt also make this attempt. They have argued from empire on the situation of capitalism has changed radically from the time of Das Kapital. They argue that immaterial labor has taken the dominant role in the production of wealth. Hardt Negri proposed that out of this new form of capitalism emerges fundamentally new possibilities for revolutions. Hardt Negri's project of defining empire and multitude runs completely opposed to the orthodox Marxist tradition characterized by Marxism-Leninism. In this paper, I shall examine the project of Hardt Negri and demonstrate that their projection of orthodox Marxism has simply led them to repeat the mistakes of Karl Kautsky in his analysis of ultra-imperialism. Furthermore, it should be argued that Hardt Negri's revolutionary program is a postmodern version of the flawed productive forces theory held by dogmatic Western Marxists, especially Karl Kautsky's, and reiterate its refutation of orthodox Marxism. One must understand empire in order to understand the basic project of Hardt Negri. They begin their analysis of empire by proclaiming that we now live under a new order in the world. They state, quote, "The problematic of empire is determined in the fact by one simple fact: there is now a world order." They point out that we live in an era of the United Nations, the European Union, among other supranational institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. Hardt Negri see these institutions as emerging out of the need to create a world order. Consequently, the sovereignty of the nation-state begins to erode with the rise of these supranational institutions. Hardt Negri write that contemporary transformations of supranational law, the imperial process of constitution, tends to either directly or indirectly to penetrate and reconfigure the domestic law of the nation-states, and thus supranational law powerfully overdetermines domestic law. In other words, Hardt Negri argue that the conventional nation-states must cede their sovereignty to a new universal normal order. These institutions arise out of and supersede nation-states with the aim of establishing order in the world. Hardt Negri assert that empire is not born out of its own will, but rather it is called into being and constituted on the basis of a capacity to resolve conflicts. In addition, they argue that peace, equilibrium, and cessation of conflicts are the values toward which everything is directed. In order to secure this order, empire develops a new juridical apparatus to police the world, but first empire must actually establish this as the right to police. They assert that nation-states can no longer act as an authority over another, but that they must mediate through empire. They also assert that war in general assumes a new logic under the just war theory. Hardt Negri argued that empire accepts first, this is quote, first, the legitimacy of military apparatus insofar as ethically grounded, and second, the effectiveness of military action to achieve the desired order and peace. They claim that the war is now a force of intervention used to establish order as well as the new morality of empire. They assert that supranational subjects that are legitimated not by right but by consensus intervene in the name of the type of emergency or superior ethical principles. Hardt Negri argue that the withering of the nation-state as the center. They argue that the withering of the nation-state as the center of power, imperialism is over. More significantly, they assert that countries like the United States only occupies a privileged position in empire. Hardt Negri view imperialism as that which the sovereignty of the nation-state was the cornerstone of imperialism that European powers constructed through the modern era. For them, imperialism was really an extension of sovereignty of the European nation-states beyond their own boundaries. The difference between empire and imperialism is that empire establishes no territorial center of power and does not rely on fixed boundaries or barriers. It is a decentered, deterritorializing apparatus if rule that progressively incorporates the entire global realm within its open, expanding frontiers. Empire envelopes a global state of affairs. As a consequence, revolutionaries no longer have a fixed point of power which they can strategically attack to bring empire down. In fact, they claim it would be rather naive to think that only social movements in Washington, Geneva, Tokyo could attack the heart of empire. One will not find Hardt Negri shedding tears over the loss of nation states. In fact, they praise the empire over this fact. The very attempt to struggle for national liberations is a step backward for them. For them, they would say that the very concept of liberatory national sovereignty is ambiguous, if not completely contradictory. While the nationalism seeks to liberate the multitude from foreign domination, it erects domestic structures of domination that are equally severe. They reject the struggle for national liberation because they see it, because it tries to establish sovereignty from external influence. According to Hardt Negri, it produces a state which they claim is the poison gift of national liberation. Finally, Hardt Negri claimed that the declining effectiveness of this structure can be traced clearly through the evolution of a whole series of global juridical bodies such as GATT, which is the global tariffs and
Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs.
There you go. The World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF. These bodies allow for the spread of capitalism, which doesn't involve the use of nation states, but have become primary to empire. From the analysis of empire, the move to modes of resistance to it. Hardt Negri reject forms of resistance, espouse the position that modern capitalism exists in a biopolitical form, and that the methods of resistance take multiple forms. Hardt Negri quickly reject any statist ideologies such as Leninism. They argue that if empire exists as a completely hegemonic phenomenon, which disperses its power in a network of relationships rather than a fixed point of power, no, quote, old ideas can liberate humanity from empire. They claim that the revolutionary project must take into account the new situation. Hardt Negri make use of the French philosopher Michel Foucault and his concept of power to make sense of the new situation. For Foucault, quote, power must be understood in the first instance in the multiplicity of force relations eminent in the sphere of organization as the process which, through ceaseless struggle and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or reverses them. The relations that people engage in and produce power rather than some external force that imposes power onto people. In addition, Foucault asserts the omnipresence of power not only because it has the privilege of consolidating everything under its invincible unity, but because it is produced from one moment to the next, at every point, or rather in every relation from one point to the next. Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. Hardt Negri adopt the concept of power, and for them it is now exercised through machines that directly organize brains and bodies towards a state of autonomous alienation from the sense of life and the desire for creativity. Another concept they borrowed from Foucault was biopower. Foucault saw that the biopower was integral to the development of capitalism because the latter would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomena of populations to economic processes. What biopower is the actual power over life and its reproduction. Hardt Negri say that biopower thus refers to a situation in which what is directly at stake in power is the production and reproduction of life itself. Hardt Negri don't necessarily see this as a bad thing because, quote, Foucault fails to grasp the real dynamics of production in biopolitical society. What Hardt Negri mean with biopolitical is the production of social life itself in which the economic, the political, and the cultural increasingly overlap and invest in one another. Where Foucault comes up short, Hardt Negri looked at Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari for guidance. Hardt Negri believed that the work of Deleuze and Guattari sidesteps the baggage of structuralism and can focus our attention clearly on the ontological substance of social production. However, they only managed to articulate it superficially and ephemerally as a chaotic, indeterminate horizon marked by an ungraspable event. Hardt Negri see that the social production itself is becoming a new side of struggle and potential revolution due to the nature of immaterial labor. Hardt Negri claimed that in empire that the central role previously occupied by labor of mass workers in the production of surplus value is today increasingly filled by intellectual, immaterial, and communicative labor power. The theme runs through their entire work, including Commonwealth. Hardt Negri do not mean that material labor has vanished, but the kind of labor done today produces images, information, knowledge, affects, code, and social relationships. Again, all of this corresponds to what Hardt Negri referred to as biopolitical production. Because Hardt Negri see capital as ceasing to be the organizing role in the production process, the revolutionary potential for this kind of labor arises. Cognitive labor and effective labor generally produce cooperation autonomously from capital's command. In fact, what Hardt Negri assert that in order for these works to be truly productive, capital must unshackle them from management. In a standalone essay, which is common in communism, Michael Hardt says that biopolitical production exceeds the bounds of capitalist relations and constantly refers to the common, grants labor increasing autonomy, and provides the tools or weapons that can be wielded in the project of liberation. The view that capitalism now is that it exploits the workers by expropriating the commons or the fruits of these labors as the new problem of capitalism. So for instance, open source software like Inkscape or GIMP can be accessed for free rather than purchasing the expensive copyrighted software made by Adobe. This kind of common property cannot be privatized and controlled as property, but is more difficult to police, or it can be privatized and controlled as property, but it is more difficult to police because they are so easily shared and reproduced. This form of property is no longer scarce, so there is no capitalist logic to be had in rationing it through a market mechanism. However, capital does not exploit the common, does indeed exploit the common, which becomes a central theme around commonwealth. Hardt Negri assert that the exploitation of labor power and the accumulation of surplus value should be understood in terms of not profit, but capitalist rent. Much in the same way that people find shelter by renting an apartment, now the property relations of capital entail that one can only access the common by paying a rental fee. As Hardt says, patents and copyrights, for example, generate rent in the sense that do not guarantee, or that they guarantee an income based on the ownership of material or immaterial property. One doesn't rent food when one is hungry because one must consume, or one consumes the use value of the product. However, the use value of software remains intact after multiple uses. With the rise of immaterial labor, Hardt Negri wants to argue that we need to understand the new nature of classes. No longer can we rely on the rigid dichotomy of wage workers versus the capitalists. Antonio Negri offers the concept of multitude to encompass this new diversity of workers. He says, the factory state is no longer in the center of value of production. The value is created by putting to work the whole of society. We call multitude all the workers who are put to work inside of society to create profit. We consider all the workers in the whole society to be exploited. Men, women, people who work in services, people who work in nursing, people who work in linguistic relationships, people who work in the cultural field, and as much as all social relations. And insofar as they are exploited, we consider them part of the multitude, and as much as they are singularities. We see the multitude as a multiplicity of exploited singularities. The singularities are singularities of labor. Anyone is working in different ways, and the singularity is the singularity of exploited labor. The reasoning behind multitude can be seen in Empire when Hardt Negri talk about the new composition of labor. They write that some labor is waged, some is not. Some labor is restricted to the factory walls. Some is dispersed across the unbounded social terrain. Some labor is limited to 8 hours a day and 40 hours a week. Some labor expands to fill the entire time of life. And some labor is accorded a minimal value, while some is exalted as the pinnacle of capitalist economy. That the labor now required to produce and reproduce capital cannot be configured to the old category from the key concept they want to express. They account for unwaged workers engaged in so-called domestic work by asserting the problematic nature of social labor. Hardt Negri see that capital as extending its exploitation to all aspects of life. And just what they mean by domestic labor is, it comes from the concept that in order for people to actually get back to work, to get back on the job, there needs to be some minimal level of people doing labor outside of the actual workplace. So one of the things can be considered would be like domestic works as a spouse doing dishes, cleaning, cooking food. Basically, they're ready to get the worker for the next day of work and getting them back to work. So that's sort of domestic labor in a nutshell. So what does revolution against empire look like, and how does it occur? How does multitude factor into the equation? Hardt Negri claimed that the multitude called empire into being, playing off of Hegel, and this is ironic because they're ferociously anti-Hegelians. They claim that empire is good in itself because empire played a role in putting an end to the colonialism and imperialism. Now that empire has enveloped the globe, alternatives to empire have no choice but to come from within. Moreover, Hardt Negri see any attempt to establish an outside empire as completely futile. Hardt Negri see not a new rationality, but a new scenario of different rational acts, a horizon of activities, resistances, wills and desires that refute the hegemonic order, propose lines of flight, and forge alternatives constitutive itineraries. Lines of flight is another concept borrowed from Deleuze and Guattari. In the book A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari say that every rhizome contained lines of segmentarity, according to which it is stratified, territorialized, organized, signified, and attributed, etc., as well as lines of deterritorialization down which it constantly flees. Hardt Negri interpret Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome as a non-hierarchical, non-centered network structure. Deleuze and Guattari say that there are no points of losing water, you say that there are no points or positions in a rhizome, such as those found in the structure of tree or roots. There are only lines. This concept is extremely important to Hardt Negri because, as they say, the assembly line has been replaced by the network as the organizational model of production. Because immaterial labor is so dominant in empire, these networks are able to undermine empire internally because the cooperative aspect of immaterial labor is not imposed or organized from the outside, as it was with previous forms of labor, but rather cooperation is completely immanent to the laboring activity itself. This becomes the core of Hardt Negri's idea of resistance. Multitude is developing its own means of resistance by simply engaging in immaterial labor. Hardt Negri do not simply think that multitude will work its way out of empire. It must formally rupture with empire. They developed the idea further in the book Commonwealth. They write that the class struggle in the biopolitical context takes the form of exodus. By here, exodus we mean, as at least initially, a process of subtraction from the relationship with capital by means of actualizing the potential autonomy of labor power. This is to say that the multitude must break its parasitic relationship with capital by making a grand exit. Hardt Negri continue, exodus is possible only on the basis of the common, both access to the common and the ability to make use of it. The capitalist society seems driven to eliminate or mask the common by privatizing the means of production and indeed all aspects of life. Hardt Negri put forward the idea that the relations of production are continually being strained by the new forces of production, which ultimately lead to a rupture with the existing order. But this rupture doesn't simply happen by itself. The multiplicity of singularities that are produced on the biopolitical field of the common do not spontaneously accomplish exodus and construct their autonomy. Political organization is needed to cross the threshold and generate political events. All of this must happen within an element of kairos. Kairos is, as they put it, which comes from the Greek word, is the opportune moment that ruptures the monotony and the repetitiveness of chronological time. The term singularities has been mentioned a couple times now, and it's worth fleshing out just what it means. For Hardt Negri, singularities are composed of three characteristics. First of all, every singularity points toward and is defined by a multiplicity outside of itself. No singularity can exist or can be conceived of on its own terms, but instead, both in its existence and definition necessarily derived from its relations and other singularities that constitute society. Second, every singularity points toward a multiplicity within itself. The innumerable divisions that cut throughout a singularity do not undermine, but actually constitute its definition. Third, singularity is always engaged in a process of becoming different, a temporal multiplicity. One case to see a concrete manifestation of this idea is by working backwards through the concept of institutions that they explore in Commonwealth. Institutions emerge out of revolts that happen, such as Stonewall, the South African apartheid struggle, the Italian worker revolts, or the Zapatistas. Institutionalizes the struggle and allows it to continue. So, for example, they use with the Zapatistas is that they developed through the creation of autonomous assemblies, coroquilas, or base community structures, and the juntas of a good government. So for Hardt Negri, institutions are based on conflict in the sense that they both extend the social option operated by the revolt against the ruling powers and are open to internal discord. Institutions also constitute collective habits, practices, capacities that designate a form of a life. Institutions are finally open-ended in that they continually transfer by the singularities that compose them. The concept seems to imply something that which is atomic and autonomous, while at the same time being interdependent and constitutive. Now for the question of organization, Hardt Negri choose to reject the traditional organizational forms based on unity, central leadership, and hierarchy because they are neither desirable nor effective. The concept of exodus must remain in its biopolitical mode and take advantage of the autonomous aspect of labor. The question that Hardt Negri needs to answer is, how then can the multitude organize itself without sacrificing the autonomy of singularities that compose it? The problem of organization is actually solved by biopolitical labor. The three characteristics of biopolitical labor, the cooperation, autonomy, and network organization, provide solid building blocks for democratic political organization. They assert that there exists no need for an elite group of individuals to come along and organize the multitude. The multitude organizes itself every day by engaging in its creative labors. Hardt Negri's program can be summed up in the following. Our political task is not to resist these processes, but to reorganize them and redirect them toward new ends. The creative forces of the multitude that sustain empire are also capable of autonomously constructing a counter-empire, an alternative political organization of the global flows and exchanges. This, however, remains radically insufficient. Hardt Negri's philosophy reiterates a mistaken idea in Marxism known as the productive forces theory. The productive forces theory can be traced back to Marx's preface to a contribution on critique of political economy in 1859. And in Marx wrote that, at a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, or with the property relations within they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relationships turn into their fetters. Then begins the epoch of social revolutions. First, to clarify the terminology, what is meant by productive forces is the labor power of the proletariat, the technology used as well as the materials that form a commodity. The problem of capitalism arises in how these three elements come together to make up the process of production. Marx understands that the relations of production as how people interact within the productive process. The relations of production are determined by the status of property, that is, the ownership over the means of production. Under capitalism, the proletariat produces the commodities which benefit the capitalist class when they extract a surplus value from the sale of the commodity. The state mediates this relationship by enforcing the laws of private property. Marx saw a growing antagonism between the forces of production and the relations of production that can lead to our revolution, that is necessary, and that as a necessary condition for revolution, it was necessary for the productive forces to intensify. Marx stated this when he said, "No social order ever perishes before all the productive forces of which there is no room in it have developed, and the new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself." In order for communism to emerge, capitalism must first develop its productive forces to such a high degree that it would strain the relations of production and lead to an upsurge of revolutionary activity. This became a dominant viewpoint until 1871. However, Marx ultimately came to reject this view. In Chapter 3, Section 1 of State and Revolution, Lenin shows the experience of the Paris Commune had greatly altered Marx's thinking. Marx warns of the Paris workers that any attempt to over the Paris workers of 1871, the comrades, the Paris Commune, the Paris workers that attempt to overthrow the government would be folly of despair. When the communards seized the Paris for 2 months, Lenin notes that Marx did not persist in the pedantic attitude of condemning an untimely movement. Instead, one should draw the lessons that the productive forces theory of revolution became invalidated by the concrete experience of the Paris Commune. The success of the rebellion and the revolution showed that the productive forces theory grew even more discredited by the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and the Cuban Revolution of 1959. All of these revolutions occurred in relatively backwards countries which lacked advanced productive forces. However, one might argue that Hardt Negri did not subscribe to a productive forces theory, yet this is not the case. Hardt Negri's analysis of immaterial labor leads them to conclude that there are new possibilities for revolution. As multitude creates the commons of easily reproducible goods that can be disseminated freely, this creates a problem for capitalism in that it has a hard time imposing the constraints of private property. So the task for multitude must keep producing until the time is right, until the time of Kairos. As these productive forces increase, the relations of production will begin to alter to the point of a revolutionary rupture. This creation of alternatives within empire overlooks at least two things. The first is that the commons, to some extent, exists. Any person with a computer can download just about anything from free computer software to music to movies. Capitalism still remains unchecked by this. The second problem I see is that it necessarily excludes a large majority of the world and privileges the first world as the source of revolution. This is problematic because not everybody has access to the commons, as it were, and with the ability to engage in immaterial labor. More importantly, the world of immaterial labor is made possible for More importantly, the world of immaterial labor is made possible for the material world of labor. Computer programmers don't program the computers that they don't have. These computers were made with the materials that come from all over the world. So while the multitude are running around all hours of the day engaging in cognitive labor on their smartphones, there are children in Africa being murdered over conflict minerals to make that smartphone. This leads to the second problem with Hardt Negri. The other problem with Hardt Negri is their bold assertion that imperialism is over in the world. We have to ask ourselves the question then, what is imperialism? The best answer that can be offered to this question is the one given by Lenin in his seminal work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Its main components, as Lenin lays out, are the following. One is the concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. Two is the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation of a basis of this for finance capital or of a financial oligarchy. The export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities requires exceptional importance. Number 4 is that the formation of international monopolist associations which share the whole world among themselves. And 5, the territorial divisions of the world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. The age of industrial capital and free competition has given rise to a monopoly of industry. Banks have become important in that they are able to grow from a modest middleman into powerful monopolies, having at their command the whole of the money of the capital of all the capitalists. The capital that they are holding becomes finance capital that allows them to begin investing in various enterprises. Lenin notes that experience shows that it is sufficient to own 40% of the shares of a company in order to direct its affairs. This becomes important because it allows for a chain of ownership leading the banks down to daughter companies of buying up shares of that company. Moreover, this holding system not only serves enormously to increase the power of the monopolists, it also enables them to resort with impunity to all sorts of shady and dirty tricks to cheat the public. Because formally, the directors of the mother company are not legally responsible for the daughter company, which is supposed to be independent and through the medium of which they can pull off anything. If one wants to engage in risky behavior to avoid responsibility, one needs to only invest into another company and conduct operations through that company. This holding system allows for the investment into other countries, which gives rise to multinational corporations. Moreover, these financial oligarchies also buy up banks as well as banks in other countries. The banks begin exporting surplus capital off to the countries in the form of loans. Lenin writes that the goal of finance capital is skinning the oxen twice. First is to pocket the profits from the loan, then it pockets other profits from the same loan from which the borrower uses to make purchases. With the return of super profits, Lenin gives the argument, or argues that it is possible to bribe the labor leaders in the upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. It should be noted here that labor aristocracy exists in the first world countries. It is made possible because of imperialism in the third world. Many of the so-called immaterial labor positions that Hardt Negri prized so highly are made possible by the super profits acquired through imperialism. And just to sort of flesh that out, when you're making loans to a country through imperialism, one, you're getting money back for the interest paid on the loans, but then you're also selling them commodities from that loan, so you just get money back from that. And so you're generating an enormous amount of super profits, which you bring into a country. And then what you can do is with that extra money, begin paying off workers in various industries to keep them polite and just keep them going about their business. And that's, in a sense, what the labor aristocracy is it's just well-paid workers in first world countries. It should be noted that finance capital exists as a form of immaterial labor. Hardt Negri seemed to have the profound belief that the revolution will be made by the ranks of the labor aristocracy. The fact of the matter is this: the site of revolution in this day and age is not the computer programmer designing open source software. It's the guerrillas fighting a struggle for national liberation from U.S. imperialism, the jungles of Colombia, using the orthodox Marxism-Leninism as their guide. Finally, Hardt Negri's conception of empire isn't a new idea, and it has been radically refuted by history. Karl Kautsky had a similar notion in mind when he theorized ultra-imperialism. Lenin spends a significant portion of imperialism slashing through Kautsky's analysis. Hardt Negri unfortunately made the same mistakes. Lenin, quoting Kautsky, the urge of capital to expand can be best promoted not by the violent methods of imperialism, but by peaceful democracy. This leads Kautsky, again Lenin quoting him, to conclude that the phase of ultra-imperialism, of a union of imperialisms of the whole world, and not the struggles among them, a phase when war shall cease under capitalism, a phase of the joint exploitation of the world by international united finance capital. This is precisely what Hardt Negri argue is happening as a tendency in the empire and the world today. They claim that empire is coming into existence to put the world into order and to pursue peace. Kautsky's analysis irritated Lenin because it was completely opportunist as well as social chauvinist. And essentially the reasoning behind that was because you're living in Germany and Germany's imperializing the rest of the world, and what you're saying is, no, we should let this continue to happen because it's going to yield this sort of ultra-imperialism that'll end all wars. You're basically just saying, yeah, I've got to do it, so tell the rest of the world. Lenin summed up this point by saying it is the most reactionary method of consoling the masses with hopes of permanent peace being possible under capitalism by distracting their attention from the share antagonisms and acute problems of the present times and directing it toward an illusory prospect of an imaginary ultra-imperialism of the future. Hardt Negri are certainly enthusiastic about the prospect of empire as it creates a new situation for revolution, which, as they see, sidesteps the old mistakes of the 20th century. For the first time, a global democracy and peace is possible based on all biopolitical labors of the First World. Nevertheless, they failed to grasp how tight this is claimed order. They failed to grasp how tight the claimed order is emerging. It seems clear that the United States doesn't form the center of power of empire. The United Nations would have significantly more success in reining in their excesses. Over the years, the nations of the United Nations have voted overwhelmingly to end the United States blockade against Cuba 19 times. It's clear that the United Nations doesn't have the capacity to impose a legally binding agreement of the United States. Hardt Negri also claimed that agencies like the IMF are now becoming the dominant force in the world. The IMF isn't some neutral global entity spawned out of nowhere. Hardt Negri overlooked the fact that the United States Treasury Department remains the largest shareholder in the IMF and thus continues to pull its strings. The holding system described by Lenin remains in wide use today because we live in the age of imperialism. Imperialism is not about extending sovereignty beyond the borders of nation states. Indeed, imperialism is the reign of finance capital. The United States did not become directly involved when it went to see Venezuela overthrown in 2002 over the interest of national security, or more specifically the oil that Venezuela has. The United States uses the IMF and the National Endowment for Democracy as a buffer to keep its image clean, and it's just simply baffling how Hardt Negri managed to not take this into account. What Hardt Negri proposes an analysis for the new situation of capitalism and empire is nothing more than what Karl Kautsky was proposing as ultra-imperialism. The fact remains that we are living in the highest age of capitalism, imperialism. This remains self-evident from the fact that this seems evident from the fact of Lenin's analysis that he showed that imperialism is the reign of finance capital. What Hardt Negri proposed that the labor aristocracy will somehow save us through its biopolitical production, the problem of empire seems absurd. Hardt Negri clearly don't have a sufficient analysis of the world situation, and that their solutions reflect this poor analysis. It seems quite clear that if one wants to engage in revolutionary activity, it would be best to find the quickest lifeline away from Hardt Negri.
How do you want to proceed?
It's a small enough group. Do you guys just want to circle up chairs and chit chat?
Sure.
Let's do that.
There you go.
Alright, so it's mostly free-form discussion, so we'll just talk about a bunch of things.
Nathan had something to say.
I was on his stance on national liberation, and I don't really understand why he's opposed to it. I mean, he's saying it's a bad thing, like that national liberation won't lead to, I guess, any revolution or.
It's not that it won't lead to a revolution, it's just the fact that it's trying to acquire a state outside of empire. I mean, this is why I think it's just bogus. I mean, you have Cuba as a state who's managed to resist empire. It's the best it can for an island. You have lots of countries in South America doing just as well. I mean, obviously, like, Negri's like in favor of like Lula in Brazil because you paid off the IMF. But essentially, it's no, we don't want to have a state. Like, and moreover, it's the fact that what we should be pushing towards is more of a global community, as in like, yeah, we should have a global democracy now because empire is spread everywhere. So,
Sorry. So like the idea that their national liberation would be our struggle, is that what they advocate, kind of? Like national organization shouldn't involve anyone outside those national borders.
well, it's simply they see it as an attempt. They see it as an attempt to try to get outside of empire, which they say is one, you can't do it. So all these alternatives have to come within empire.
Okay.
And so, and two, I mean, they literally say that, like, yeah, the state is the poison gift of national liberation. And that's a direct quote from them. So they would be against, like, FARC in Colombia.
Well, and I think there's a couple things to be said. First off, the reason why they're against national liberation struggle is because they're dumb. Really dumb. But the second thing is, for those who aren't familiar with national liberation struggles, it's a particular sort of struggle that emerges in the age of imperialism. And what happens is you have an empire or an imperial power that takes over someplace, and then you have a nation, which is a group of people who share like the same language or the same culture or just the same history, and they want to determine themselves. Well, they're not allowed to determine themselves because these outside forces determine it for them. So in the most naked sort of fashion, it would be like South Africa, right, where you have a literal colonial power that is occupying and then, forces essentially black Africans to do whatever the whites want. But the softest way would be like, again, through the IMF, where you just buy up all their banks. The banks make them do everything that you want them to do, and as such, they become puppets. Latin America is where this happened most predominantly, although, again, you have like Pinochet, who is an old kind of throwback.
Yeah, the IMF specifically, actually, I mean, most people forgot, like it's the International Monetary Fund, and essentially they go to developing nations and offer them loans, but also they make the governments comply with certain reforms, such as, you need to do the local right, start opening up your markets, these sort of things. So that's just what happened with those.
Right, and so what happens is this national liberation struggle is a struggle for these people to throw off the chains of their oppression. But here's where Negri has the problem. He says, look, you're fighting for a nation, right, because it's a national liberation struggle. What you don't understand is empire is now global. And so for you to fight for your particular struggle in this particular way is backward looking, because you're not recognizing, hey, I've got to fight for a global international struggle rather than an individual struggle. And again, the good example that he uses, right, is the Zapatistas. Because the Zapatistas aren't looking for real freedom for Mexico. They're not looking for their own nation state. They're not looking to cause a revolution. They're not looking to end capitalism in Mexico. What they're looking for is to be recognized by the juridical apparatus of Mexico and the global community, which, of course, in less fancy terms, goes under human rights, right? So there, this human rights struggle, for indigenous people, and then you have solidarity through the global community and through the internet, and you have activists flying in because empire allows for travel and the free flow of ideas, and there's all this political theater. And so that's what we need to do to oppress groups is, set up web pages for them and et cetera, et cetera. The problem is the Zapatistas are still under domination. They're still under constant threat. But you take Hugo Chavez or Evo Morales, the problem that Negri sees is they're erecting a state, and a state is repressive, and a lot of times in a socialist state it's repressive towards capitalism. And in a lot of ways, for example, it cuts off information and connection and this free flow, because there's not a free flow of capital, there's not a free flow of ideas. For example, you blockade Cuba, you blockade Venezuela, you blockade, Bolivia, and suddenly they can't get a lot of the supplies that are necessary for this sort of global network of empire. And instead of, having these smart solutions where you put everything on the internet, for example, you have old-fashioned institutions, which is like direct or representative democracy that carries out the policies that help the people, or just otherwise screwing with capitalism. And because they don't embrace this very, in a really strong sense, it's a very narrow view of what global struggle should look like. Because Chavez, because Evo Morales, because the FARC or the ETA don't accept this very narrow form of internationalism or global revolution, they're completely dismissed and they're backward looking at the poison fruit.
Yeah, and just to sum it up, one, Negri completely rejects socialism as a sort of, what they're not looking for is a sort of classic dialectical, okay, well, there's the negation of capitalism through socialism, and then negation, you live in a state, and we erect communism. They think that it has to come all at once in a sort of momentary global rupture, where we just exodus from capital. They haven't really fleshed this out. But also, when they claim that multitude called empire into being, what they're actually specifically referring to is the fact that all these calls for internationalism, for proletarian internationalism, that's what led to his empire. So that's sort of where they're going.
So would he consider Che Guevara as saying, because he wasn't Cuban, it wasn't necessarily his revolution, but he left Argentina obviously and went to several other places, and kind of, I don't really know how to say what I'm thinking. But anyways, he would be for those things, but I don't know, I'm just trying to.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah. please.
So I think what you're asking is, would Negri approve of Che Guevara because he had an international spirit? He left his own homeland to help fight, first off in Cuba, and then in Africa, and then in Bolivia. So would Negri say, oh, this is the sort of international characteristics we want to have? I don't know specifically if Negri has talked about it. I think the answer is absolutely not. And the reason why is because in each instance that Che was fighting, he was fighting for a concrete people to establish a concrete set of conditions to help their concrete people, rather than this global, like, he wouldn't like Che Guevara, but he would like a rich, erudite New Yorker who flies to all the G8 places and riots, because, you know, it's an integrated network, you know, and is connected to all these black box groups, you know, throughout the world, because that's a network. It's non-hierarchical, it's non-domination. For Che, it was hierarchical. First, he was a soldier. He was below, you know, Castro and Raul, and he took orders and he fought how he was supposed to. And then as a leader, he issued orders, again, to create a structure whereby capitalism was suppressed through strength of people. So I think he would hate Che Guevara, although it would be really unpopular to say so, and I doubt he would ever say so.
Yeah, I mean,
As an internationalist, I guess.
Right, but he also views internationalism as a bad thing.
yeah, it's backwards looking because, again, like, we should be working towards global democracy and global goals. But also, I mean, their rejection of the state comes from the idea that, well, yeah, it doesn't really respond to the people's imminent, respond to the actual imminent desires of what the actual people really, really want, which is a convoluted notion in itself.
So yeah, like I get how this is how they're not Leninists. Like that's pretty obvious, and of course, like I take like huge issue with Hardt Negri because of the national liberation question. I don't really get how it's not Marxist though. It's pretty thoroughly Marxist. I mean, even when Marx talked about like India, it was this idea like, oh well, it's good, you know, like even though they did all these like the British did this horrible thing to India, it was good because they were able to develop their productive forces to, you know, so that they could possibly have, you know. You see what I'm saying? Like,
I see what you're saying, but also it's Marxist up until 1871. Like, again, this view gets rejected wholeheartedly. And then there's several people that held on to it. And this is why I think it's a bad theory. Is because one, it's just saying, hey, everything should keep going the way it is because we're doing new biopolitical productions, people are working more autonomously, and there's no center of power anymore. But also, that view is totally wrong because we still live in imperialism where people are dying every day for mass profits. And so to say that we should keep letting these productive forces build and build and build, then it'll eventually change the relations of production. One, just isn't historically accurate. I don't think there's been a revolution that's came from that. But two, history has actually shown that the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, all.
of course, but what they're saying is that within capitalism is contained communism, and the more that capitalism spreads and develops the productive forces all over the world, the more it's just actually communism eventually, you know. It
I mean,
seems to be the idea.
if your idea of communism is just file sharing.
Yeah, it's not my idea, but it seems like that's what they're saying, and it seems like that is not, there's nothing non-Marxist about that. Great.
One thing to keep in mind is orthodox Marxist means Marxist-Leninist. So it's not orthodox Marxist like there's no other form of Marxism, but orthodox Marxist, as opposed to the Frankfurt School, right, cultural theory, critical theory, also opposed to Western Marxism, which interestingly enough is not orthodox Marxism, which would be like your Gramsci's, your Sartre's, and then also, sorry, this is really distracting. The other thing to keep in mind is, what I would say is, they're Marxists, they're just bad Marxists. And I'm not one.
They're just bad Marxist-Leninists.
No, they're not bad Marxist-Leninists, they're bad Marxists.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, here's the thing. Rosa Luxemburg did not agree with Lenin on a lot of issues. But I think she was a relatively good Marxist. I think she had failed policies. I think she had failed plans for revolution. But also, she had really good Marxist analysis, which is why she sided with Lenin in internationalism and was against Kautsky. But what the problem with Negri and Hardt isn't that, you know, they disagree with me or my view or Lenin. It's that they're bad. But I mean, because you'll notice, we have a friend who's a Trotskyist, and he essentially espouses the same position, this same entire position that has been espoused from early Marxists like Bernstein up to Kautsky's assertions, the Western Marxist assertions, right? I mean, the critique of the European Marxists of the Soviet Union from essentially 50 to now is, well, the reason why the Soviet Union is so awful and China's so awful and Cuba's so awful and we're all good Marxists because they haven't developed their productive forces. Yeah, that's a position you can have. You can justify it within the body of Marxism. Also, it's a stupid, sucky position, and I'll say it. It underlies a sort of social chauvinism and racism. So, yeah, I would say that Marxists are just bad.
I mean, again, like any essay, tying specifically back to his preface and the critique of contribution of a critique to political economy. I mean, that was his view. Like he said, look, revolution's going to happen at the first countries first, or first ones, because eventually people just get immiserated and want to take over. But also, I mean, they use the economic and philosophical manuscripts pretty heavily too, especially in Michael Hardt's essay on the idea of communism. He's talking like, look, oh well, Marx said this about mobile labor versus immobile labor, so we should start taking these ideas more. And essentially, what they were also arguing was that what Hardt argues is that look, the way industrial society has become to influence all relationships vis-a-vis production, they argue that immaterial labor is going to do the same thing, that it's going to start being the regulating force that's influencing all of our relationships. So like if with immaterial or the actual material production begins like, okay, well this is the working day, it was from 5 in the morning till 1 at night or something like that. But yeah, it begins to actually influence how the rest of society functions. So just thinking that immaterial labor is going to do the same thing. But I mean, it's just really a bad analysis. It just makes for more autonomous capital. People actually doing stuff. I was going to mention this. Their idea of class too, I think it's bogus. Basically, they don't see they don't accept the whole dichotomy of, well, you're the actual capitalist, you own things, and you're the worker, you're exploited. It's just that everybody participates in society and sort of contributes to capitalism, and there are actual people that don't contribute to capitalism. So I mean, even Pierre likes to bring up this example. It's like, well, I own stock now, so I'm technically part of the capitalist class if you want to go by the old analysis. So this sort of notion of rejection that there aren't really again, the point is there's no center to power anymore. It's all in the relationships. So I don't see how that flushes out to the revolution when it's like, oh yeah, these are the capitalists, we should make them stop being capitalists. It's just, well, we got to work through this. Right, Mike Fry.
So this is autonomous Marxism, right? That they espouse. How is that similar to Trotskyism, or would they agree with the permanent revolution theory? Trotsky.
To be honest, I haven't studied a lot of Trotsky, but I don't know.
Yeah, they actually wouldn't go with Trotskyism. Well, okay, they would in some things. The analysis is the main thing. The analysis of capital, but their prescriptions are totally different. Depending on the Trotskyists, whether they're just ultra-liberals or actual Trotskyists, what I'm going to say it online, the ISO are a bunch of ultra-liberals. Their position can be everything from, well, actually, let me be frank. Trotskyists accept, however imperfectly, the dictatorship of the proletariat. They believe that the working class should rule. There's a lot of debate on what that means to have the working class rule, but they fundamentally believe in that, and that there should be a repressive apparatus. And again, there's a lot of debate on to what extent it should be repressive, who it should repress, what ways it should repress, but they accept a repressive apparatus. Negri and Hardt don't at all. It's the term that they love to use is imminent resistance. So rather than have a formed corps, a formed party or vanguard or army, right, like the FARC has that resists, and there's a whole swirling society around them. What you do is you resist where and when you can, however you can, by slowdowns at work, or throwing bricks at cops, or burning down bad buildings like banks or whatever. And so this is what they see as their sort of project.
And for instance, all the riots in Europe, I'm sure they're going like, oh yeah, this is really cool, because nobody told them to go on the streets, it's just people going on the streets. Like, it's spontaneous, it's best, like, that's spontaneous gets, right? It's the actual opportunist position. But to have like somebody come in and be like, okay, but now we should, organize and prolong this, they would be against that because it's one, I mean, they're making use of spin-outs a lot. So it's transcendental to the actual multitude of people doing stuff, and it doesn't actually respond to what they would say is their imminent desires and feelings. Again, that doesn't really cash out to anything. I mean, they're using the desire in this losing lottery, which is that it's the sort of creative desire, and they're also using it off Spinoza, and then it's a sort of like bubble of life that leads them to want to do stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for any problems Trotskyism might have, and those are numerous, I think it's clearly better than this autonomous Marxist. Part of the reason is what has come of it. You'll notice that the theory, again, Trotskyism is not a particularly good theory. It really can't account for what's going on in the world. And we kind of know that it's not a very good theory because all we have to do is look at its track record. It's had very little success. But at least, at the bare minimum, it does a fairly good job of mobilizing, and it does a pretty good job of tailing history and pointing at things and being like, oh, that was good. Like, for example, Cuba. Most Trotskyists like Cuba, and they point to Cuba, and they're like, oh, hey, there's less people dying there now. That's a good thing. But autonomous Marxism, you'll notice out of the paper, it's their literal position on struggle is to create institutions. Now, that's a funny sort of revolutionary struggle that your very goal is to create institutions within capitalism.
Right.
Now, I mean, going off Lenin, the reform should be a byproduct of revolution. Revolution is not brought about by reform. Just as an example, cultural studies, which is hugely under attack. Women's studies, Chicano studies, black studies, or African studies, depending on where you're at. Those were a product of both women's demand for equality and revolutionary struggle for equality. That was the black demand for national liberation. That was the Chicano demand for national liberation. That began to create these institutions. But for Negri and Hardt, the very goal is to carry on the struggle enough that they get the institution. And that seems like a losing plan because, as they said, empire uses these institutions to help mediate relations. I don't want a better IMF. I don't want, a better police department, and a better riot intervention. I want those gone. And so, in a lot of ways, Negri and Hardt are also very pessimistic. They wrap it up in their optimism. They're very, very pessimistic that, their theory is you have to wait for the productive forces to catch up. 2, the best that you can hope for is an institution. And then 3, somehow it turns to communism. I'm reminded of the internet meme where it's like, buy alligators, and then there's a line, and it says like question mark, question mark, question mark, and then like a line, and it says profit. And there's this missing step where if you buy alligators, you'll get rich. Well, you do Negri and Hardt's plan, and then you have communism. There's a big gaping hole in how you get from one to the other.
I mean, they have the concept of exodus, and it's sort of like, we're going to take what's ours, and the capitalists, they try to do it, and then we're going to fight back. They're not necessarily pacifists in the sense they think that force would come down to it. They're obviously not saying, oh yeah, we should go, bring about the French terror. But I mean, another thing that's interesting too is their analysis of the world isn't like, I mean, they're saying, oh yeah, we've got these theories about what's going on, but they're not like trying to actually prescribe them to the world. What they're saying is like, oh yeah, this is happening, and we think this is what's going on. They'll like take their analysis that way, but actually don't do it materially enough, in my opinion. But it's just sort of like, oh yeah, well, we noticed that people aren't really writing in Washington; they're writing at the WTO in 1999 in Seattle. So that's going on. So we're going to write the book about that. It's sort of ad hoc, like, oh yeah, but this is now part of multitude journalism. But it's not like, oh yeah, multitude should be going this way or doing that. It's not given to their desires.
Yeah, and also, right, they don't want to set up a new hierarchical system.
Right.
And, having any positive program where you actually say what it is you want people to do would be hierarchical. So you just kind of let it happen.
But also the funny thing I noticed, and this is just an observation, is traditionally in Lenin's Stalinism, it's like, where does the communist intelligentsia come from? It comes from the upper strata of society, just because there's actually more time for people to think about theory and this sort of thing. But also the immaterial labor positions are in the upper strata of society. And these are the ones that are learning the sort of skills to organize and do stuff, and somehow they'll spread it. Like, it's kind of a weird parallel.
Isn't there sort of a danger when there's a lack of a sort of escape velocity, when there's no minimum program of things to accomplish? I mean, think about it from this perspective. What sort of political program that anybody is interested in promoting doesn't think that what it's doing is the most equal and fair thing to have? I mean, if you refuse to prescribe a sort of positive program and you literally omit that because you don't want that to be oppressive, then just anything goes.
Well,
I mean, you have neoliberals, they think that's the fairest, most equal thing that they can do. I mean, aren't you afraid if you're going to assert and be dominant and create institutions that enforce some sort of specific notion of, say, egalitarianism, that you're doomed to just, I don't know, sort of in a sense, boil yourself alive?
well, so in Empire, at the end of the book, they actually give 3 demands that they see that Wall Street should be pursuing in some capacity. One was the right for everybody to move everywhere, because we're in a global society now. People should have the freedom of global citizenship to move around. The second was that everybody should have a right to a social wage, and that because everybody in society is productive in some means to actually producing society, even as in capital, then everybody should get a social wage. And then the third was, I want to say that it was the right to appropriation of what people made, the right to the production in a sense. So that's sort of what they demanded, and also in Commonwealth, they recognize that capitalism is in crisis with the financial meltdown in 2008, but they're like, oh no, that would be terrible if capitalism collapsed now because we're so close to Commonwealth basically. And so they actually say, oh yeah, well, we should do all these reforms where we start investing in schools and green technology and these sorts of things. So I mean, they're sort of given this sort of idea, but what my problem is they don't flesh out how file sharing and writing code and using open source software, these sorts of common projects, cash out into some sort of communism, other than just there's a bunch of free stuff on the internet for everybody to go to.
Couldn't that in a way, though, describe Bismarck's policy?
I'm not.
I mean, all right, so, hold on, I'm thinking about the correct. So they said the same thing about Bismarck. They were starting to develop all those technological innovations in Germany. And then in addition to that, they started to develop all these social programs because people were starting to make demands. Some people wanted socialism. They were kind of afraid of that. But they were like, hey, how about we make the small steps and then give people a retirement wage and sick leave and things like that. I mean, if we make all these little demands, won't that ultimately just end us up in a very similar situation to the sort of Bismarck situation, or here in the United States, how we got the New Deal?
Well, I mean,
the New Deal is a New Deal for capitalism, not for liberation.
Well, I mean, it seems to me though that what they're arguing is, capitalism shouldn't collapse just yet because we got all this cool new stuff we can do with it, which could lead to communism. And that's essentially just what they're arguing. So we should save capitalism in order to, go further to communism.
Right. I mean, which is in what a sense, to describe those two historical events.
But all this does is save capitalism. It doesn't get rid of it.
So you would agree then that there's no possible way. It's not necessarily impossible, but there's historical precedents for doing the same exact plan and ending up saving capitalism for capitalism's sake.
Yeah, that's reforms. That's all it is. One, I mean, the idea that their reforms are out there. It's they're radical stuff. You think we want education for everybody. We have a right to a clean environment. These sort of things. One, we're not going to get those under capitalism. So I don't know why they're wasting their time. It seems to me that, and again, this goes back to the problem that they're radically anti-socialist. They basically want communism now instead of going through a process of socialism, which even seems dumb. It's if you wanted to actually develop the productive forces to the way where we could have communism, it seems like we should be doing that under socialism and not under capitalism. The problem of Negri just says, here's the thing, communists, they're against the state, which is true, but also it comes later. I don't think they're missing that point. And again, I think it goes back to a poor analysis of classes, because it's what's the state do? It suppresses we use one class to suppress another. Well, what happens when everybody's sort of this multitude of people doing stuff? I don't think it cashes out.
Can you speak more about what their ideas are on the kairotic moment?
It seems to me that again the multitude, begins engaging in more and more material labor and getting more organized, and developing these sort of networks of resistance here and there and everywhere. And at some point, again, it just sort of like basically what they say is, if there's a passage where it's like, oh yeah, this might not seem like I have a fight for some of our friends, but don't you worry, because when we have Exodus and we take what is ours, there'll be some fight back then. I think they should literally say, oh yeah, we'll need some sort of rear guard, watch our backs while we, shoplift capitalism.
Baju has a lot of cool terms, and they needed a cool term. And kairos is a cool word.
Kairos is a cool word.
That's a good word.
So you appropriate some Greek, you have this moment, and you got another cool term.
But really, isn't their moment really just a threshold, though? It seems to me like that's what they're
It
shooting
would seem
for.
to be the point at which the productive forces strengthen the relations to productions such that they change radically.
So it's just like when communism is represents over 50% of the total, when multitude represents over 50% of empire.
But I would also keep in mind they're ostensibly using Foucault in such a way and losing Guattari in such a way that it's all about the spread and the relationship itself. It's not about taking over the center of power. Again, they literally say that we couldn't possibly attack Washington D.C. or Genoa or Tokyo and expect it to dissolve empire overnight. I'm sorry, if an asteroid were to just fall out of the sky and take out Washington D.C., I think we're going to see a lot of changes. So.
So everyone might already know this, but autonomous Marxism, the reason they're not giving us a plan to do anything is because they're autonomous Marxists, right? And very similar to, I mentioned this in class when we actually had class. When Baju and the meaning of Sarkozy is talking about his 8 points of resistance that we can all engage in now, I think that's very much akin to what Hardt and Negri think they're doing in Commonwealth. There are these means of tension that if we push hard enough, you're right, capitalism can't possibly sustain, but that's why we push for them. And of course, these two guys writing in their bourgeois lives can't give a face to the revolution, and they think that by not saying anything, by keeping silent, they're making this profound statement. But make no mistake, they do it intentionally. The revolution comes from those who are in it, who are doing it, not from 75-year-olds, scholars making, a bank off terrible novels or books, endorsed by Harvard. But Hardt Negri are very aware of that. It's autonomous Marxism. They give us points of tension to push for, but it has to come from the people in the street, the people actually doing the rioting, the people actually organizing. And I think that to say, well, they're not giving us a plan is sort of a shallow critique, as much as I agree with it. They're not giving us any sort of positive prescription to what to do. But it's very particular. That's why they're autonomous Marxism. That's what the definition means. It's autonomous, it's free-flowing, it's spontaneous, it's all of these sort of hack job notions. I agree with that. But that is what it means. That is autonomous Marxism.
Yeah. In one breath they'll say, oh, we're not doing spontaneous, oh, we need some sort of organization. But also at the other end, it's like, but yeah, people also do stuff on their own. And material. One of the points they harp on Lenin for was, oh yeah, somewhere in the state revolution, I didn't define it. But Lenin basically argues, yeah, but everybody needs bosses. We've always had bosses, so in the revolution they're going to need bosses. But now, labor's autonomous, and in fact, it's trying to get rid of bosses so people can open up the creative process more. So they don't need bosses then, so somehow they'll organize themselves
You
spontaneously.
could be your own boss, isn't that the neoliberal point?
Yeah.
I think the real critique to make there is that who is the boss? Well, it's the immaterial labor who has enough time to sit and have these discussions. It's the first world who gets to sort of lead this spontaneous movement or this, this multitude and its immaterial forces. Like we said, the people in Colombia are out there engaged in concrete struggle because they don't have certain needs. They don't have food, they don't have water, they don't have a roof over that. They can't, self-determine their own, 5-mile radius. The concrete struggle is taken to people like, the Palestinians and the Colombians, or taken to the oppressive forces by the Palestinians and the Colombians. And those are the real forces we should be focusing on, I agree. But Hardt Negri, I think the real critique is these immaterial movers are the first world. Like, we're supposed to really take hold of the reins here.
Well, of course, right? It would be the first world that gets to lead the revolution, right?
Yeah, to put it bluntly, it's this sort of inverse Maoist third worldism, where the rest of the world doesn't have the internet yet, so they can't really do revolution. It's just
Imperialism apologetics is what it is.
don't really have sympathy. I mean, because I'm not very well informed on Negri and Hardt, but I mean, wasn't Negri involved in like some
Absolutely. He
In
was,
a lot
he
of
was
political
waking up at 5 in the morning,
activity?
going to the factories, organizing, at 7 going and teaching at the university, going back, seeing how everything went, going home, writing an essay, going to bed, waking up, doing it. He was definitely engaged.
Yeah, it was Operaismo Autonomo, I think what it was. But essentially it was workers' power in Italy in the 70s. Yeah, he was doing all that stuff, like literally going to factories, talking to workers, engaged in this sort of thing. The problem was the movement became so intense, and this is where the Brigadero Rosso, the Red Brigades, which were basically sort of like the weathermen in Italy, except they actually killed people. They killed
Moro.
Aldo Moro, the president of the Social Christian, Democratic Christian, whatever. And so what happened out of that was there was a huge fallout. The government became ultra repressive and started arresting people. And they actually arrested Negri and held him responsible for killing Aldo Moro. Negri gets elected to Congress, overwhelmingly, their representatives or whatever. But also they're like, no, you can't do that. And he's like, well, whatever. And so he leaves to France. That's where he goes and meets like the losing lottery, and like Michael Hardt was there hanging out doing his thing. So he picks up the sort of postmodernism. I mean, like basically what their project, if you want to boil it down, it's taking Das Capital and mixing it with 1,000 Plateaus, and seeing what we can get out of it. So, but I mean, and Michael Hardt, the same thing. Like he went to Nicaragua and El Salvador. He goes to El Salvador, and it's like, oh yeah, the people there. It's like, it's really cool. You guys are coming down there and helping us. And Michael Hardt's like, yeah, we'd love to be here. What can we do to help you guys? And it's like, here's the thing. What you should really do is pack your bags, go back to America, and actually make a revolution there. And he's just like, what does that even mean? And it's like, well, it's simple. Do you guys have mountains there? He's like, yeah, we got mountains. It's like, okay, well, what you do is you get the guns, you go to the mountains, and you make a revolution. And they're just like, we don't even know what guns to take, man. It's like Reagan's in the White House. Like, there's no way we can do this. And so, I mean, that's just sort of like his failure for his movement. So.
Yeah, but didn't you just describe like what Cuba was like when they landed on the shore?
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't it just seem as impossible at that moment as well?
Well, I'm not going back to Michael Hardt.
I know, but what I'm saying though is like, I mean, it seems to me it's just like this sort of indomitable task of like actually committing yourself to that sort of resistance is tough, and maybe perhaps sort of a maybe a psychological criticism here. Maybe it's just the sacrifice is not being willing to make. We don't need to break that many eggs, and definitely not me that needs to be breaking eggs.
Well,
right?
Obviously, none of us agree that we should also go up into mountains with guns, though. I mean, like he's right in that it's different here.
But I think some of us have actual commitments to prevent imperialism from taking over the world.
Sure.
Well, as a side note, what I would say is, yeah, Negri was really great when he was doing stuff. There's a joke that I love to tell. Why do you throw a brick through a Hilton window? So Antonio Negri will catch a cold. He doesn't do these speaking tours for free. And there was a whole steel empire. It's all online. I don't hear that anymore. They don't talk about people stealing multitude or commonwealth like they did with empire. And again, he's making in the thousands and thousands of dollars on every conference, on every lecture, on every visit.
How much then? Like, don't we even pay people to come? And that guy that spoke about Palestine, he brought his book. I mean, we paid him, we bought his books.
Well, here's a big difference.
I don't know how much he's making.
All those guys, they made enough to cover their ticket and hotel. That's it.
Oh yeah.
And
They didn't ask for exorbitant fees either. It was like, hey, if I can maybe get a hotel room,
it was about $500 for them. And Josh Sykes, who was from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, last year came out on his own dime.
Yeah.
Now, again, if you're just taking airplane, it's possible Negri's only getting airplane ticket and hotel. It's just the Hyatt Regency and it's first class nonstop.
And from what I understand, he actually can't teach in Italy. Like that's what his job was. He's a political science professor before everything's happened. And I think he's actually in his day more because again, it's sort of this corrupting influence. They want to prevent that.
He's still alive, right?
Negri is, yeah. And the Commonwealth came out in 2009. We're still writing. books, unfortunately. But I mean, even then, like the whole Steel Empire movement, I don't even think they put Commonwealth on there for free. Because like, they did it with Empire, they did it with Wall Street.
Empire's the only one, I think. Yeah, it's free.
It's not on the file sharing.
I mean, you can get it online, but they
You have to
explicitly
steal it.
put it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to steal it. They're not giving it away.
Empire.
It is not the Commons.
Also, they won't let you print Empire, the PDF. Like if you, the free one they give away, like you're not allowed to print it. You can just have it on your computer.
I don't agree with everything that they say. I guess I just don't really, because I mean, even something that Hardt said, he was in an interview with some dude from Berkeley on YouTube. I watched it. He was saying, I just didn't like the way he was saying. Antonio Negri was like the ocean, and all these fish were in the ocean, and the revolution's a fish in the ocean. When you take away the water, and the revolution's dead. Just to say that somebody was a revolution, that they had that much impact, I think is very, very elitist. And I mean, I don't necessarily agree with them, but I don't see how writing Empire, having these views, are inherently wrong and bad. I mean, I understand how, like, yeah, going to throw rocks through windows and say, go to your protest isn't going to help, but
Would I-
in a sense,
Well,
how is it bad?
Well, I mean, it seems to me if what you're saying is that, like,
His
when,
idea.
if it's a reference to Italy when, you know, Negri left, the movement sort of dissolved. I mean, you could blame that on not having an actual concrete movement, like an institution, what they want to say, but I mean, like, actually having like a movement that can actually go underground and evade the sort of repressiveness of the government, that's actually disciplined. Like, they don't have that. They didn't have that in Italy.
What I would say is his ideas are not inherently bad; they're concretely bad. It's not that there's some, yeah, it's not like there's some fantastic destiny whereby it's a truism for time and all eternity that Negri and Hardt are wrong. And if they were writing this in 1870, it would be great. It would be groundbreaking. But by 1871, we already have, no, as a matter of fact, you don't get communism. This is what people don't grasp. Paris Commune, and this is, again, I'm making a dig because he didn't come here, but I'll make a dig when I see him next, this is one of the problems with Trotskyism, some forms of Trotskyism. Marxism is a whole different animal. You don't win the revolution by growing the forces of capitalism. The Paris Commune happens when France is in complete disarray and Napoleon III is under guard by the Germans. The Russian Revolution happens not at the height of the Russian productivity, but when the country is absolutely devastated by war. World War II, we don't get the national liberation struggles because the productive forces of capitalism have grown. We get them because they've been so devastated by World War II they can no longer hold on to their colonial powers. Now, if none of that happened, and in fact, it was the most productive countries that were the first to go to socialism, then Negri and Hardt would be right. And I would hope, at least, that I would be following Negri and Hardt. But the problem is, history hasn't shown us that. As the productive forces grow, capitalism is stronger. I mean, it should be, it's funny that it's not, I'm not criticizing you or anyone in particular about this, but it's really a very intuitive idea that the stronger capitalism is, the stronger capitalism is. And so, in fact, if we look, it's these ruptures in the weakness of capital, in these weak links in capital, that lead to victory. So,
what victory?
well, I mean, you know, the fact that the Soviet Union stopped the Nazis, I think, is a pretty good one, which wouldn't have happened had the Tsar or the provisional government stayed in power. If you look at the life expectancies across the board, communist nations, with the exception of Cambodia, do incredibly well relative to comparable capitalist countries, and it's an oddity. It's an amazing oddity if you have a communist country that doesn't have a literacy rate of 99%, and we're talking countries that, you know, grandparents' generation, you'd be lucky to have a 10 or 20% literacy rate. Those are concrete gains. Those are real wins that Negri and Hardt don't want to accept. Which is,
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but aren't those victories, as small as they are, or if they are small, outweighed by the decay of the communist world that exists today? China, Soviet Union's gone. I mean, Cuba, you can say it's still existing, but I think it's giving ground every day to capitalism still. Does I mean, the opposition or the antithesis of what these guys are saying, and I'm not coming from a point where I know what they are saying exactly, but it would seem that, well, the true revolution or a violent revolution will lead to equality, even if it comes at the cost of bloodshed, but have we seen that in history? I agree we haven't seen the ability of organizations in capitalism to fight communism, but have we seen the opposite? Have we seen grassroots people's movements not turn into dictatorships? Have we seen the ability of violent, true Marxist communism to fight capitalism any better than what these guys are saying?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. And obviously, since we're still under capitalism, we don't have any judgment on what will ultimately kill capitalism. But what we can do is we can look at history and see what destroyed other movements, other systems. And like, for example, you'll notice the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire didn't die and especially if you count the Byzantine Empire as part of the Roman Empire, as the Eastern District. The Roman Empire didn't die by a violent overthrow. It died a death of 1,000 cuts over years and years and decades, and again, if you count the Byzantine Empire, even centuries, right? The same thing with feudalism. Feudalism wasn't felled in a single swoop by the American Revolution or the French Revolution. It died the death of 1,000 cuts from the Swiss republics and the Italian republics and the Peasants' War and all these other forces and fights that were crushed, that were absolutely obliterated. The Florentine Republic is my favorite example. Niccolo Machiavelli is crushed, tortured, and the thing only lasts 30 years and you have the monarchy back. Well, this long process, during those times there was evidence of progress. And I mean strong evidence of, for example, getting rid of the monarchy. You could see how it was concretely changing. For all the failures of historical, to use the term, really existing communism, they did make significant strides. And not only did they make significant strides, they significantly weakened capitalism in ways that I can't point to how file sharing is weakening capitalism. And in fact, we have strong reason to believe that now that we're doing file sharing on your iPhone or on your computer, that it in fact is strengthening capital. I can't see an instance where, for example, Karl Kautsky, who was the German Social Democrat, who was espousing more or less the same view without the postmodern update, I can't see where he helped the German working class, but I can see where his views help undermine and betray people leading a real revolution. And like Rosa Luxemburg, I can see where this entered and decayed the moral character of the working class, such that instead of having an internationalist position, which again, Negri and Hardt are against internationalism, is backward looking. Instead, they had a faux, critique of ultra-imperialism that at the end of the day just led to the good old-fashioned support of imperialism and the good old-fashioned support of capitalism, right? We got to save capitalism for the sake of X. We've got to support, this is what Karl Kautsky said, we support German imperialism because it leads to this ultra-imperialism that makes it easier to have unity. The problem is it never gets past that. And so, yeah, obviously, Marxism, Leninism we still live under capitalism, so it hasn't been completely successful. But we've seen Negri and Hardt's movement in the ELZN. And yes, the ELZN and the Zapatistas have made progress. They now have health clinics. But they haven't made the progress that, say, the FARC, which are large autonomous regions that are now run by village councils and large infrastructure expenditures. And we can see this sort of students movement and a WikiLeaks and all that. And yeah, okay, that does some, but it's the concrete struggles on the ground in India and Nepal that are taking this Marxist-Leninist approach, that are winning, for example, the first right to be gay and the first openly gay politician in South Asia. That wasn't brought about through coordinating networks of biopolitical production. That was the Communist Party or the Unified Communist Party of Nepal, Maoists, saying, no, we're going to use force in the form of our state to ensure the legal rights of homosexuals. Again, yeah, obviously it hasn't worked if you define work as the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, but by any real criteria that can be substantiated, it's been wildly successful than anything else. And so my point is, go with the institutions and programs that work, rather than the ones that are of dubious quality, that aren't,
Well, to trivially summarize what he just said, I mean, capitalists are terrified of the Naxalites and the Maoists in Nepal and the Indian Revolution. Is capitalism afraid of Hardt Negri? No.
And they're not
I'm
afraid
sure
of-
John
they're not
McCain
afraid
is,
of
but-
set pieces either.
Or
I
the
don't
team.
think they are. But
Hardt
I just
Negri, nothing they do I see as a direct assault to capitalism.
Well,
in any way, shape,
and that might be the brilliance of it. I'm not saying that Hardt and Negri are right, but I mean, when we see things like the Maoists in India, we see them in the jungle, and we see trains being blown up, which is great. I mean, but we don't see the Indian government changing. I mean, Tamil tigers, okay, they're killing people, and I'm not saying that. Well, I am saying that's bad, but I think like the Green Revolution in Iran, that came about by Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that, and I'm not sure if that's what Hardt and Negri are saying should be the revolution, but maybe the revolution should be televised, and maybe it should be televised on the internet, rather than these out of the corner Tamil tigers in the hills with no communication to the American intelligentsia. I'm not saying that the American intelligentsia are going to do more than the Tamil tigers, but if they're together, if they're communicating, if we have American universities talking to Iranian school kids, I think it has a chance for peaceful revolution, possibly.
But you're talking about a view that incorporates both aspects, whereas Hardt Negri are saying that what the Nepalan Maoists are doing is counterintuitive to, or not counterintuitive, counterproductive to the overthrow of capital. They're saying international struggles are contradictory in themselves. You're talking about a view that incorporates the best of the first world with the best of the third world. I mean, the revolution isn't going to have one paradigmatic form, and to think so is extremely parochial. But to say that what the Naxalites or what any revolutionary, Colombia or Palestine or India, to not support that movement as against capitalism, to me that just seems bullshit. Outright, utter bullshit.
Well, and I mean, again, there's a lot to be said. I mean, there's one thing. I mean, no offense, you seem like you're relatively new to to a lot of this.
Yeah,
you haven't gone over the readings, and that's fine. But also, my response would be, what's Negri's excuse? Right? He's been learning and teaching this for years and years. And in fact, I mean, most of the communiques from the FARC come through independently created satellite internet that they do while they're on the move. The Maoists in India record everything and transmit it to various, journalists throughout India, and they do so through, stolen bandwidth. Now, that's all great, and again, the point is not to be a Luddite that no, you can't use the internet to help things. The point is that as the concrete struggles have unfolded over the last 200 years against capitalism, this position is not new. This position has been espoused, and this is also why it's not just that they're wrong. This is why I think they need to be confronted on this. The more people who are taking this position, and they would say the same about Marxist-Leninists, right? And anarchists who believe they're right would say the same about Marxists, and Trotskyists would say the same about, quote-unquote Stalinists. But if you think of you as wrong, and you think of you as hurting the actual concrete struggles, then you would argue against it. So in this case, I think people adopting Negri and Hardt's view that, hey, yeah, all I need to do is, microloan to good places in Africa and, steal all my file sharing, and then occasionally show up to a WTO thing to throw bricks through the window, and then eat, all sorts of interesting international foods because we're now all connected, I think that's a bad plan, and I think it's a concretely bad plan because it encourages self-satisfaction. Passing along WikiLeaks is good. Right? I don't want anyone not to pass it along, right, and post it to their Facebook. But also, WikiLeaks only matters really on an international level. The fact that it's carried through the networks doesn't mean that now we live in an era without networks. It now means that we live in an era where those concrete national interests need to be confronted, and they need to be confronted with all sorts of different ways. But if everyone like reads WikiLeaks and they're like, wow, that's really messed up, doesn't do a whit to stop, U.S. imperialism or et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, it's actually really funny, and Greg and I were talking about this. It's like, yeah, in one sense, WikiLeaks is sort of this, non-centered, non-hierarchical network of sharing information, whatever, one gets re-territorialized, WikiLeaks site goes down, but then lines of flight open up new sites for mirror sites. And so yeah, this sort of weird losing watering thing going on with WikiLeaks. But also, the real thing we should pay attention to WikiLeaks, it's undermining international relationships and actually reasserting nation states. So I don't know. And again, I take really issue with the fact that U.S. imperialism is not really. I don't ever knew what European imperialism was. It's because imperialism's over. We're gonna live in an empire now. I think it's just bogus and wrong. It's demonstrably true that the United States is the center of power.
That's a really interesting example because it was, as soon as WikiLeaks became a public source document, it was really interesting to see how quick nation states divided.
Mm-hmm.
How quick no one wanted any communication with the United States because we had jeopardized so much. We saw Russia completely stop talks of any sort of communication exchange. And in Europe did the exact same thing until we figured out our own, spy situation, which really demarcates the nation state and imperialism are alike now, I think.
Well, and this kind of goes to what Lenin, and again, this is why I'm so critical of Negri. I mean, and not really so critical of you. I'm guessing you haven't read Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And if you're new, there's no reason you would read it. It's not like one of those intuitive books that you just heard floating around, like The Great Gatsby. You're like, oh yeah, I better pick up Lenin, the Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. But in it, he argues against Kautsky, and what he says, and it's clear, he's like, yeah, there's big periods of peace, and this was written right before World War I. He's like, yeah, it looks like we're moving towards a global community. It only looks that way because every moment of peace causes the inter-imperialist conflict to seethe underneath. So that rather than, this apparent peace we have and are moving towards, all it does is reasserts the very violence of the inter-imperialist nation state when the peace is broken. And we were moving towards a new world order, which is what Negri and Hardt would like to focus on after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the nation state's over. Well, and then we have Iraq, and then we have Afghanistan, and not just the United States, then we have South Ossetia, right? And then we have the conflicts in Ukraine and Russia over oil, and then you even have talk of the EU, which was empire par excellence. It's basically facing a position where it either needs to become a nation state and re-territorialize itself, qua nation state, or the various countries and nation states in it are on the verge of ripping it apart. So the solution in either case is not empire, is not the deterritorialization of the nation state. It's the reinscribing of the nation state either more strongly or the ruination of international agencies through the nation state breaking away. And again, this goes back to the critique of Negri and Hardt. Why don't they see this? Why weren't they able to predict this? Why weren't they able to understand this? Well, the answer is simple. They don't believe in imperialism. And so nation states acting on imperialist motives doesn't make any sense to them. And again, that's why I think they need to be argued against. Because if you take this view that is wrong, and you do this analysis that it's wrong, and the working class, even worse, if the working class takes this as their own tool, they'll constantly be disoriented because they won't have the analysis to actually be able to know what's going on, I mean, obviously, history's not fixed, but they're saying the world is trending in one way. If the working class believe that, and then everything happens to the contrary, they're going to be incredibly disoriented, politically speaking. So.
All right. Well, somebody else got any questions, comments? Things they want to talk about?
I do have maybe a little comment or two. Here's the thing. They have this sort of analysis of power that leans a lot on Foucault and then perhaps also on Spinoza or something like this. I think it's worth pointing out that not all sources of power or resistances are equal, nor are they all not equally top-down and things like that. I think the criticism, probably from a more orthodox standpoint of Marxist-Leninism or just traditional Marxism, is that the social relationship that seems to dominate, regardless of things, of these other resistances or singularities, is they seem to be translated primarily through the capitalist mode of social production, and nothing seems to be escaping that. And it doesn't look. Maybe, I mean, theoretically, it might be possible that they could reach this kairotic threshold, whereby the terms of social relationship are changed. But I think that all the criticisms being made from the perspective of Marxist-Leninism hold water, specifically because it doesn't appear like anything like file sharing or these different postmodern subjectivities or anything like that seem to be breaking or even filling up the tank of getting closer to that threshold. So this is why I just don't think that it really holds water. And I heard that, during the class, and I think, all the evidence is pointing towards that now. But on top of that, situations where individual, for instance, states or countries can actually set up different forms of social relationships, it is precisely because they are able to form things like national struggles or somewhat separate themselves via the mechanisms of having a nation and not being, not being able to resist, I guess, world organizations, precisely because they can set up different areas of power, different forms of social relationship. There is hope. But of course, it's not at all through this sort of Hardt Negri theory or criticism. So I guess that's my comment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I say South America stands. I mean, they sort of try to abduct Bolivia and Commonwealth of Beta. We did the whole section. But I mean, what I would argue actually from a Marxist-Leninist standpoint is, look, you have various nation states rejecting U.S. Foreign policy, rejecting U.S. imperialism. Venezuela, Colombia is trying to do it, but also they have Santos in power, which is directly being funded by the United States. But Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, all these places pretty much are just straight up saying no more U.S. imperialism. It's not like, oh, there's this global network of relations imperializing us through imperial processes. They're rejecting the United States, and there's a particular reason why. It's because they're on the brunt end of U.S. imperialism.
Right. Here might be another example which I think would be more controversial and also kind of illuminate the problem. I mean, look at a country like Venezuela. The number 3 source of gas or petrol that the United States gets is from Venezuela. But does Venezuela have the ability to segment itself away and create different institutions of power? Yes. It's precisely because it's a nation state and precisely because it can resist on a national level. So, I mean, it's worth pointing out that literacy is exploding there as well. But, yeah. So, I mean, I just don't think that, yes, obviously people need to trade, especially if you have, like, zero resources in your country. Cuba, again, not a failure of communism, but it's a failure of the rest of the world and the fact that it has to trade with the rest of the world. These are things that are worth considering, but, different power and social relationships are isolated to a community or a particular area that it's not necessarily universalizable.
Right.
I mean, so.
But even then, I mean, the whole, I mean, this is, I'm also going to be agreeing with you here too. But I mean, the problem with this sort of anti-imperialist analysis is it's like, look, the United States has an embargo on Cuba. It's not empire doing this. Also, if empire, right, the United Nations wanted them to dissolve this, they would do it. One, they don't have the military backing to give a binding agreement to the United States. The United States can just say, oh, don't care ever. But two, the United States also puts restrictions on other capitalist countries, other places, from actually doing business with Cuba. If any ship docks within Cuba, I believe it's what, 6 week waiting
6
period?
months.
6 months. They can't dock in U.S. ports. Like, this doesn't sound like some sort of global peaceful order imperial, as they would say it, not imperialist, project that they're working towards. Like, no, sorry.
Mhm.
Go back to the drawing board. But, alright, anything else? Should we go get food?
Yes.
Then I will conclude. Thank you. I would just, the two epigraphs I had on my paper were, this is from Marx. Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. And then from Alain Badiou, without the least hesitation, Marx would have recognized in Negri a backward romantic. I believe that deep down, what truly fascinates these movements is capitalist activity itself, its inflexibility, and also its violence.